Hey everyone, Lee Pacchia here at Mimesis Law, and we're talking again today with Professor Houman Shadab about the Bitcoin space. Really fascinating stuff. Professor, thanks for stopping by. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So, wanted to start off by getting a feel for what the regulatory picture looks like for this emerging field. Really exciting times to be talking about Bitcoin. Where is Congress on this? Is this something that's on their radar? Are people starting to realize that they might need to jump in and maybe write new legislation or regulations covering Bitcoin?
Yeah, right now Congress has other priorities than digital currency and Bitcoin, certainly. Last year, Congress had some hearings, and the Senate and the House, they looked at Bitcoin.
And you testified in some of these, right?
I testified before the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. It was technically a public hearing they had, wanting to know about what is Bitcoin, how would it fit within their jurisdiction, and particularly Bitcoin derivatives, which they would, in my opinion, be regulating directly. So there's not much action at the congressional level, but at the federal level there certainly is. So certainly the regulators of money transmission, so primarily the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is part of the Treasury Department, they have a continuing interest in making sure that digital currencies are not used for money laundering, and criminal financing, let's say more generally speaking. And the FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, just in October of 2014, released additional guidance essentially saying why certain exemptions do not apply to digital currency companies that are using Bitcoin maybe more indirectly or as part of their business, but they don't, even though they don't fall under the direct category of, let's say, exchanger or transmitter of money, they still would be regulated and required to comply with all of the regulations of the Bank Secrecy Act. That's at the federal level for that purpose. At the state level, New York State and other states are looking at how to regulate digital currency businesses from the perspective of money services businesses regulation and requiring to be licensed, but tailoring those licenses uniquely to virtual currency companies. And as has been gained a lot of attention was New York's BitLicense proposed regulation, which basically was relatively broad in terms of what companies it captured and relatively stringent in terms of what requirements would be mandated upon digital currency companies, money services businesses in the digital currency space.
So apart from the obvious suspects of New York and California, which states appear to be moving into this space most aggressively or most favorably for this nascent industry?
Yeah, certainly Texas seems to not have such an aggressive approach to requiring the licensing of digital currency businesses. Nonetheless, though, after a lot of feedback from the Bitcoin users and Bitcoin economy, it seems that the New York State Department of Financial Services is going to be reproposing their BitLicense proposal, and actually not so that it, first of all, it doesn't capture companies that use Bitcoin essentially as a software platform, the blockchain, and second of all, so that the mandates or requirements on smaller digital currency companies are not going to be so stringent. So in other words, there will be some kind of transitional licensing requirement.
Going back to the regulatory scheme, obviously the CFTC has a lot to say about Bitcoin these days. How do you characterize their approach thus far to the concept?
I think most regulators, including the CFTC, has been very thoughtful, has sort of looked before they leapt. And when I was speaking before the CFTC in October of 2014, before their meeting or their hearing, they seemed to be genuinely interested in what sort of experts had to say. And my basic conclusion was that Bitcoin would fall under their jurisdiction as a commodity to the extent that derivatives such as futures or swaps reference Bitcoin. I don't think that point is controversial, even though it's not official yet. My additional point was that smart contracts or automated contracts that use the underlying Bitcoin technology or underlying Bitcoin blockchain that replicate essentially futures contracts or swaps contracts or essentially automated derivatives, they should not be subject to the CFTC's entire body of regulation, if not exempted from it perhaps even entirely, if the smart contract developers can show and create comfort for the regulators that that smart contracting system still achieves regulatory goals, such as transparency, market stability, and protection against price manipulation.
Jumping outside the government for a moment, do you see a profession taking shape to deal with the new businesses as they're developed and the new regulatory approaches to them?
Absolutely. So to date, at least the third quarter of 2014, there's been over $300 million of venture capital invested in emerging small Bitcoin companies. And anytime there's an emerging economy, there needs to be legal services provided to them. So I see law firms, large, medium, and small, getting into this space. Certainly there's some early movers like Perkins Coie, Pillsbury, and Catton, dealing with various aspects of the Bitcoin legal services business area, but there's also lots of maybe solo shops and other attorneys developing their expertise in advising and perhaps defending at some point, if litigation arises, digital currency companies.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about the concept of big law firms jumping into the Bitcoin space, and I don't know if they're exactly starting practice groups, but they're getting teams of people ready to go to deal with these types of issues. Yet it's such a new thing. You know, there aren't many experts walking around in Bitcoin law because it's such a new concept. That said, what types of skill sets lend well to working in this space in terms of previous experience or specialization?
Right, certainly there's uncertainty. How does it fit in with their existing client model? And what are the risks to attorneys for representing companies that may not have a lot of legal certainty, including perhaps could toe the line with criminal activity at least. Okay, so in terms of, so that is an issue, but I think it was a bigger issue a year ago than it is now in 2014. I think 2015 and beyond, companies and attorneys, established institutions, including banks and large law firms, are going to become much more comfortable directly interacting with or representing or even partnering with Bitcoin companies as it becomes more regular. In terms of skill sets, I think it's the same skill set that would apply to attorneys dealing in the technology space and the startup space, and probably the payment space as well, because payments is the primary application that Bitcoin is being used for right now.
We recently did a segment where we talked about some of the emerging concepts and definitions and terms in the Bitcoin space, and we talked about the concept of Bitcoin 2.0. Can we unpack the regulatory implications of that stage in Bitcoin's development? What do people need to be worried about?
Yeah, I'm not sure there needs to be a worry just yet. However, there are some important regulatory issues that need to be at the very least clarified when it comes to Bitcoin 2.0. In other words, which is using the underlying technology of Bitcoin or the blockchain for something other than currency or a payment system. So for example, if you create a decentralized stock market or you create a decentralized futures contract, those regulation of those activities have typically and historically relied on regulating some kind of identifiable intermediary, which itself is a company which has human beings as directors. But here, one of the benefits of Bitcoin is disintermediating traditional financial institutions. So maybe you don't need that bank anymore to transmit the currency. Maybe you don't need a futures exchange or a stock market or stock exchange either. So what does regulation look like? And I think the general idea is that if it looks like a stock or exchange or it looks like a futures contract, regulators will still want to be involved, and they're going to put essentially substance over form. So even if the contract is essentially traded and executed and monitored automatically through a software-driven process, if it's still a futures contract, for example, the CFTC is going to want to regulate it or at least make sure that it fulfills their regulatory goals to be able to exempt it. Same thing with a decentralized stock market. If it looks like a stock market, if you're raising interests that seem like equity interests in companies, even though it's not done through a stock exchange as we understand it, if it's done essentially through a Bitcoin network, it still should probably meet, let's say, the transparency and other investor protection requirements that the regular physical stock market requires.
Fascinating stuff. It's a brave new world out there.
It absolutely is. It's exciting times.
Cool. Professor, thank you for stopping by.
Happy to be here.
That's Professor Shadab from New York Law School. If you'd like to see more of the stuff they're working on here, go check out nyls.edu. I'm Lee Pacchia. See you next time.